In 1930s Hollywood, a black choreographic genius stepped into the spotlight wearing a flawlessly tailored men's tuxedo. Refusing the subservient roles assigned to her, Juanita Pitts projected an untouchable masculine authority that defied the cinematic elite. The mainstream machine retaliated with absolute silence, erasing her so ruthlessly that history holds zero records of her birth or death. How does an empire completely obliterate a masterpiece simply for wearing a suit? In the 1930s and 40s, the American entertainment industry was a fortified empire built on a ruthless racial calculus. For a black woman, the silver screen offered only the deeply humiliating caricatures of the desexualized servant or the exotic novelty. Elegance, intellectual dominance, and sovereign authority were fiercely guarded assets, treated as the exclusive property of the white cinematic elite. To project unbothered power in a black female body was not merely an artistic choice. It was viewed as an act of treason. Prevented from accessing Hollywood's multi-million-dollar budgets, black artists built their own fiercely guarded universe, the black vaudeville circuit. It was a punishing, sweat-drenched proving ground where talent was measured purely by the unadulterated fire of the performance. It was from this uncompromising soil that Juanita Pitts emerged. Raised in the sprawling industrial landscape of Philadelphia, she didn't learn to dance in pristine mirrored studios. She absorbed the heavy percussive energy of the naval shipyards and textile factories, translating the city's complex, syncopated rhythms directly into her nervous system. Touring the deeply segregated Jim Crow South with her husband Leroy, Juanita navigated a daily maze of systemic terror. But the exact moment the heavy velvet curtains parted, all systemic terror was completely silenced. On the wooden floorboards, she was a sovereign. Yet, even within the elite ranks of black vaudeville, she remained an intimidatee, an anomaly. The industry standard demanded that female tap dancers function as visually appealing accents. They were steered toward high heels, heavily sequined costumes, and a highly feminized, eager-to-please stage presence. Juanita looked at this suffocating parameter and felt absolutely no compulsion to conform. To unleash the devastating sonic power she heard in her head, Juanita recognized a fundamental physical limitation. Mandatory high heels blocked the heavy, aggressive tones used by elite male tappers. She dropped her center of gravity and locked into a punishing, close-to-the-floor stance, driving her flat foot into the wood to maximize her percussive impact. To match this acoustic violence, she required an impenetrable visual fortress. By commissioning a pristine white, three-piece men's tuxedo and heavy leather Oxfords, she shattered the cinematic elite's monopoly on elegance. She wasn't just decoding the architecture of sound, she was actively weaponizing her appearance. When Juanita Pitts began to move, the acoustic result was terrifying in its complexity and heavy in its authority. Because she drove her entire flat foot into the wood, utilizing the full, unmitigated weight of her body. The sound she generated was not a light feminine click. It was a deep, resonant, bruising detonation. She fired off rapid-fire 16th note variations, dropping impossibly tight polyrhythms into the microscopic spaces between the downbeats of the jazz band. She manipulated kinetic friction with the precision of a surgeon, sliding, scraping, and striking the metal plates against the floor to create a cascading wall of sound. She did not dance to the rhythm of the orchestra. She actively argued with it, dominated it, and ultimately dictated the tempo of the entire theater. The environments where she forged and perfected this sovereign command were not the polite, sanitized concert halls of the white elite. They were the sweat-drenched, smoke-filled, hypercritical coliseums of the black vaudeville circuit. The Apollo Theater in Harlem, the Howard Theater in Washington, D.C., the Standard in Philadelphia. These were unforgiving high-stakes proving grounds. The air inside these venues was thick with the scent of cheap gin, heavy tobacco smoke, and desperate ambition. The audiences who packed the balconies were intimately familiar with the brutal machinery of rhythm. They were laborers, musicians, and marginalized citizens who demanded absolute, unvarnished authenticity from anyone arrogant enough to step into the spotlight. They could spot a fraud, a hesitation, or a missed beat from the darkest corners of the upper mezzanine, and they were notoriously merciless to those who failed to deliver. Juanita stepped into these arenas night after night, originally billed alongside her husband, Leroy Pitts, under the moniker Pitts and Pitts. In the traditional dynamic of a male-female vaudeville duo, the man anchored the rhythm while the woman provided the visual flair. But anyone with functioning ears who sat in the audience during their set immediately recognized a profound subversion of this established order. Leroy was a highly capable dancer, but Juanita was the undisputed gravitational center of the stage. Her acoustic footprint completely swallowed the room. She executed rhythmic algorithms so dense and so mathematically complex that seasoned jazz musicians in the orchestra pit would lower their brass instruments, staring at her feet in sheer unadulterated disbelief. The true measure of her terrifying genius was proven in the legendary cutthroat cutting contests that defined the underground tap culture. These were brutal, improvisational battles where dancers would circle each other on the floorboards, trading rhythmic phrases, daring their opponent to match their speed, complexity, and sheer physical endurance. It was an aggressively male-dominated arena, a space where the titans of rhythm tap fought violently for territory, real dominance. Women were expected to watch these gladiatorial displays from the wings. Juanita Pitts did not stay in the wings. She walked directly into the center of the cipher. She stood toe-to-toe with the absolute undisputed kings of the art form, men like the legendary Teddy Hale, a dancer whose blinding speed and aggressive style left most challengers completely humiliated. When Juanita faced off against the male masters, she did not ask for quarter, and she did not soften her strikes. The battles were exercises in supreme physical taxation. The heavy metallic clanking of their shoes against the wood echoed like an industrial factory operating at maximum capacity. Sweat poured down their faces, soaking through their collars as they pushed the human anatomy to the absolute breaking point. The male veterans of the circuit, men who possessed egos forged in the fires of racial oppression and fierce artistic competition, were forced to stand back and watch an African-American woman effortlessly deconstruct their most complex routines. She absorbed their rhythmic challenges, processed the mathematics in a fraction of a second, and fired back a sequence that was heavier, faster, and infinitely more sophisticated. She matched their aggressive, flat-footed power strike for strike. The respect she commanded from these men was absolute and uncompromising. They did not praise her by saying she danced beautifully for a woman. They praised her by admitting, with a mixture of profound awe and bruised pride, that she danced with the heavy, unbothered authority of a man. Her rhythm was a loaded weapon, perfectly calibrated and operating with lethal precision. But she recognized, with chilling intellectual clarity, that acoustic dominance was only half of the war. As long as the system could force her into a sequined dress or a tattered maid's apron, they could visually undermine her sovereign power. They could look at her terrifying masculine footwork and still categorize her as a compliant subordinate. To fully detonate the racist and sexist illusions of the entertainment syndicate, she required an impenetrable psychological fortress. She required armor. The decision to step into a tailor's shop and order a men's suit was an act of profound, calculated, and highly dangerous political warfare. This was not a subtle modification of female attire. She did not seek out a feminized, softened version of a jacket to merely hint at independence. Juanita Pitts demanded the absolute, unadulterated architecture of male aristocratic power. She commissioned a flawlessly tailored, pristine white three-piece tuxedo. The men's three-piece suit of the 1930s was the ultimate sartorial manifestation of corporate authority, financial untouchability, and sovereign control. The sharp, heavily structured shoulders of the tuxedo jacket physically broadened her silhouette, projecting an intimidating, unyielding physical presence. The crisp, rigid lines of the lapels drew the eye upward, demanding eye contact and projecting absolute intellectual confidence. The tailored vest, tightly buttoned across the torso, operated as a literal breastplate, restricting any vulnerability and encasing her core in a layer of immaculate defense. The heavy, sharply creased trousers completely concealed the shape of her legs, instantly neutralizing the hypersexualized male gaze that the industry relied upon to market female performers. By hiding the female form beneath the heavy structured wool and cotton of a men's tuxedo, she was actively revoking the audience's permission to consume her body. She was forcing them to consume her intellect, her power, and her rhythm. The choice of the color white for the tuxedo was a masterful stroke of visual dominance. In the dimly lit, smoke-filled interiors of the vaudeville theaters and the underground clubs, a standard black suit would blend into the shadows. But a pristine white tuxedo operated like a blinding, gravitational anomaly. When the heavy, high-wattage Klieg lights of the stage struck the white fabric, she became the brightest, most inescapable object in the room. The blinding white suit against her dark skin created a stunning, high-contrast, visual masterpiece that commanded absolute, undivided attention. Furthermore, a white tuxedo in the 1930s was heavily associated with the elite leisure, immense wealth, and the highest echelons of the white upper class. By draping herself in the specific garments reserved for white millionaires, an African-American woman was committing a spectacular, unforgivable theft of their most guarded visual symbols. She was projecting a level of aristocratic wealth and unbothered luxury that the Jim Crow South actively lynched black citizens for daring to display. The architecture of her rebellion extended from the crown of her head to the very soles of her feet. Atop her head, she placed a sharp, wide-brimmed fedora. This was a crucial psychological mechanism. The entertainment syndicates mandated that black female performers maintain a wide-eyed, eager to please, and highly accessible facial expression at all times. The smile was a required contract of submission, assuring the white audience that the performer was happy to serve them. By tilting the brim of the fedora sharply downward, Juanita Pitts cast a heavy, impenetrable shadow over the upper half of her face. She actively concealed her eyes, denying the audience the subservient connection they felt entitled to. She did not have to smile, she did not have to make reassuring eye contact, and she did not have to beg for their approval. The shadow of the fedora projected a cold, dangerous and completely untouchable mystery. She could look out at the audience, analyzing them, judging them, while they were entirely blocked from looking into her soul. The foundation of this sartorial fortress, the vital instruments that physically connected her to the oak floorboards, were the heavy leather Oxford shoes. They, high heels forced upon female dancers, were designed to destabilize, to force a delicate swaying walk, and to physically prevent the full exertion of kinetic force. The Oxford shoe was a mechanism of absolute stability. It featured a thick, solid sole, a heavy leather upper that rigidly supported the ankle, and a completely flat profile. This was the shoe of a businessman, a commander, a man rooted firmly to the earth. When equipped with thick metal tap plates, the Oxford became a devastating percussive hammer. It allowed her to drive the full, unmitigated weight of her body directly into the wood without the slightest risk of an ankle rolling or a heel snapping. The Oxford shoe did not just complete the visual aesthetic of the tuxedo, it physically enabled the acoustic violence of her flat-footed rhythm tap. The first time Juanita Pitts stepped out from the heavy velvet wings of the theater and walked into the blinding circle of the spotlight wearing this complete ensemble, the visual shockwave was palpable. The theater did not erupt into immediate applause. It fell into a stunned, highly charged silence. The audience was looking at an absolute impossibility. The societal programming of the 1930s dictated that a black woman could not simultaneously possess extreme wealth, masculine authority, and staggering kinetic power. Yet, there she stood, a flawlessly tailored, brilliant white monument of defiance. She did not strike a delicate pose. She stood perfectly still, her feet planted shoulder-width apart, her hands resting casually in the pockets of her tailored trousers. The jazz orchestra behind her held their breath. The silence in the room stretched, growing heavy and thick with tension. She let them stare. She allowed the audience to fully absorb the terrifying reality that she was not there to ask for their validation. She was there to conquer the room. Then, with a microscopic, almost imperceptible shift in her center of gravity, she initiated the strike. Hoary, heavy, metal-plated Oxford slammed into the wood, shattering the silence with the acoustic force of a gunshot. The crisp, white fabric of the tuxedo moved with a sharp geometric fluidity as she unleashed a devastating polyrhythmic assault. Because the suit concealed the hypersexualized movements traditionally expected of women, the audience was forced to focus entirely on the terrifying mechanical perfection of her footwork. The visual of the immaculate white tuxedo, paired with the brutal, aggressive, heavy artillery sound of her flat-footed rhythm, created a hypnotic, deeply intimidating spectacle. She was a sovereign dictator of rhythm, wrapped in the untouchable armor of the elite. Within the fiercely guarded ecosystem of the black vaudeville circuit, this visual rebellion sparked a profound, immediate reaction. For the African-American audiences who packed the balconies, watching Juanita Pitts perform in a white tuxedo was not merely an evening of entertainment. It was a deeply cathartic, vicarious triumph. They lived in a society that systematically stripped them of their dignity, their wealth, and their agency the moment they walked out of their front doors. Watching a black woman stand in the center of the stage, projecting absolute, unapologetic power, claiming the garments of the oppressor, and beating the floorboards into submission was a spiritual victory. She became a localized deity, a visual representation of the unyielding strength that the community possessed, but was forbidden from expressing in the daylight of Jim Crow America. Her male peers, the elite titans of the tap circuit who had previously engaged her in brutal cutting contests, watched this transformation with profound respect. They recognized that she was not engaging in a comedic drag act. She was not mocking masculinity. She was seamlessly assuming it because she had already earned it through the sheer, undeniable superiority of her rhythm. When she stood next to male legends like Eddie Hale, wearing the same sharp lapels, the same fedoras, and the same heavy Oxford shoes, she completely erased the gender divide. The men did not treat her as a female dancer operating at a disadvantage. They treated her as a highly dangerous, fully equal rival. She had successfully bypassed the biological and societal limitations placed upon her sex, elevating herself into the exclusive, fiercely competitive brotherhood of the Hoofers. However, this spectacular elevation within her own community sent a terrifying alarm through the corporate echelons of the white entertainment monopoly. The booking agents, the syndicate scouts, and the theater managers who observed her performances from the shadows of the VIP balconies immediately recognized the catastrophic threat she posed to their business model. The American cinematic empire was built on a foundation of highly marketable, easily digestible racial and gender stereotypes. They possessed an incredibly efficient machine designed to extract the raw talent of black performers, sanitize it, repackage it into non-threatening caricatures, and sell it to the deeply prejudiced distribution networks of the South. Juanita Pitts in a white three-piece tuxedo was fundamentally unsellable within this racist architecture. They could not market a black woman who projected more authority, more wealth, and more masculine power than the white male protagonists who populated their films. To put her on a national movie screen in that suit would be to openly admit that the racial and gender hierarchy they actively enforced was a complete manufactured lie. It would be a visual confirmation that African American women possess the capacity for supreme elegance and intellectual dominance, a concept that the Southern theater owners would violently boycott. The backlash from the industry was not a sudden explosion of public outrage. It was a cold, calculated, and highly coercive corporate intervention. The men who controlled the access to the massive multi-million-dollar contracts, the nationwide tours, and the Hollywood sound stages approached her with a deeply insidious ultimatum. They entered the damp, cramped dressing rooms after her shows, holding lucrative contracts and offering her the golden ticket to mainstream superstardom. But the offers came with a heavy, non-negotiable chain attached to the bottom line. They told her the tuxedo had to go. They praised her staggering footwork, acknowledging that she possessed a generational talent capable of generating vast fortunes. But they coldly explained the reality of the business. They demanded that she shed the tailored vest, the fedora, and the heavy Oxford shoes. They offered to build a spectacular, high-budget musical number around her, provided she agreed to wear the ruffled skirts, the high heels, and the wide, subservient smile required to make white audiences feel comfortable. They offered to make her a star, as long as she agreed to actively participate in the visual assassination of her own dignity. They applied the suffocating, relentless pressure of the capitalist machine, assuming that her desire for wealth and global fame would inevitably override her principles. They operated on the cynical, deeply ingrained belief that every black artist had a breaking point, a precise monetary figure that would successfully purchase their soul. In the heavy, oppressive silence of those backstage negotiations, Juanita Pitts drew an absolute, unbreakable line in the sand. She looked at the white booking agents, the men who held the keys to the empire, and she delivered a cold, staggering refusal. She did not negotiate for a slightly more dignified dress. She did not ask for a compromise. She looked down at the immaculate, pristine white fabric of her tailored suit, and she chose her armor over their money. She stated with the unbothered, terrifying calm of a woman who possessed absolute sovereignty over her own soul that she would rather lose him. Either roll, lose the contract, and lose the fame, than ever strip off her tuxedo to play their degraded caricatures. She refused to become a highly paid clown for an empire that despised her humanity. She knew exactly what she was sacrificing. She was actively setting fire to the bridge that led to Hollywood, choosing to preserve her absolute psychological integrity rather than surrender to a machine designed to consume her. The tuxedo was not a costume she could simply take off at the end of the night. It was the physical manifestation of her survival. The corporate architects of Hollywood had demanded her submission, and Juanita Pitts, standing perfectly straight in her Oxford shoes, coldly and unapologetically told the most powerful entertainment monopoly on earth to walk away. The physical evidence of a cultural assassination is rarely preserved, but the American entertainment monopoly left behind a single, undeniable fingerprint. It exists on a highly degraded, grainy reel of celluloid shot in 1945, capturing a modest, independently financed short film titled It Happened in Harlem. Operating entirely outside the jurisdiction, the massive budgets, and the pristine sound stages of the major Hollywood syndicates, the independent race film industry was a fragile ecosystem. These productions were shot in cramped, repurposed warehouses with rudimentary lighting rigs and static cameras, completely devoid of the sweeping, glamorous cinematography that defined the white cinematic elite. Yet the sheer, unvarnished austerity of this specific production served as the perfect, uncorrupted vessel for Juanita Pitts. When she walks into the frame, the technical deficiencies of the low-budget set completely evaporate, swallowed whole by the overwhelming gravitational force of her physical presentation. She appears on the screen exactly as she demanded to be seen, offering zero concessions to the fragile sensibilities of a segregated society. In the context of mid-century America and cinema, where black women were strictly confined to the shapeless aprons of domestic labor or the hypersexualized feathers of jungle novelties, the visual shockwave she generates is staggering. She does not look like a dancer hired to entertain a crowd. She looks like a sovereign entity, a syndicate boss stepping onto the floorboards to audit her own empire. The camera operator, restricted by the heavy, immobile equipment of the era, simply locks the frame and allows her to dictate the terms of the engagement. The audio recording technology of the independent studio struggles violently to capture the sheer acoustic pressure of her performance. When she initiates her sequence, dropping her full weight into the wood, the physical impact is concussive. She executes impossibly tight 16th note rhythmic algorithms, sliding and scraping the metal plates to create a dense, cascading wall of sound that actively fights and dominates the accompanying jazz arrangement. She dances with a terrifying cold-blooded efficiency. There's no frantic exertion, no desperate attempt to solicit applause, and absolutely no smile. Her face remains locked in a mask of supreme, unbothered concentration. She is trapped inside a cheap, grainy film, yet she commands the celluloid with the arrogant, untouchable authority of a woman who possesses the intellectual capacity to outdance every highly paid, heavily promoted white star in Los Angeles. This specific reel of celluloid, however, was destined to become an incredibly dangerous artifact. The major Hollywood monopolies, despite their public dismissive contempt for independent black cinema, maintained a highly active, deeply paranoid surveillance apparatus over the underground circuit. The corporate architects of the studio system routinely acquired these low-budget race films and screened them in the absolute privacy of their plush, mahogany-lined projection rooms in California. They did not watch these films to support marginalized artists or to expand their cultural horizons. They operated as highly efficient corporate vampires. They scoured the grainy footage, hunting for raw, unrefined rhythmic innovations, unique comedic timing, and fresh musical arrangements that they could systematically extract, sanitize, and graft onto the bodies of their own white cinematic idols. When the reels of It Happened in Harlem were finally threaded through the projectors in these exclusive, smoke-filled executive suites, the reaction among the white studio moguls was not one of artistic appreciation or predatory excitement. It was a profound, paralyzing cognitive dissonance. As the heavy, flat-footed strikes of Juanita Pitts echoed through the high-fidelity speakers of the screening rooms, the men who controlled the global distribution of American culture realized they were staring directly at a catastrophic threat to their entire socio-economic model. They possessed the expert clinical eyes of men who manufactured global idols for a living. They recognized immediately that the woman on the screen possessed a generational world-class kinetic intellect. In a purely acoustic, blindfolded competition, she could effortlessly dismantle the most celebrated male tap dancers on their payroll. But the American cinematic empire was not built on meritocracy. It was built on a highly fragile, heavily policed visual illusion of racial and gender supremacy. And Juanita Pitts, standing perfectly straight in her white tuxedo, completely shattered that illusion. She presented an impossible radioactive paradox that fundamentally short-circuited the Hollywood machinery. The executives realized with a creeping cold terror that they could not market her. To place an African-American woman on a massive national silver screen, radiating absolute masculine authority, extreme wealth, and intellectual dominance would be viewed as an open declaration of war by the deeply conservative, violently prejudiced distribution networks. Oh, if the Jim Crow South, the theater owners in Atlanta, Birmingham, and Dallas would actively boycott any studio that dared to project a black woman who did not immediately submit to the racial hierarchy. If they allowed the American public to see Juanita Pitts commanding a room in a tailored suit, they would be publicly admitting that the degrading, subservient caricatures they forced upon black actors were manufactured lies. Even more terrifying to the studio heads was the realization that they could not plagiarize her. The Hollywood machine was brilliant at laundering black intellectual property, but Juanita's genius was heavily fortified by her visual presentation. Her terrifying acoustic power was inextricably bound to the tuxedo, the heavy Oxford shoes, and her cold, masculine posture. They could not steal the routine and give it to a white actress, because placing a white female lead in a men's suit to perform aggressive, heavy artillery rhythm tap would fundamentally confuse their core demographic and violate the strict gender norms of the era. They could not give the routine to a white male star, because the optics of a premier white idol mimicking the heavy, grounded style of a black woman was considered socially unthinkable. Juanita Pitts was a master key that fit into none of their carefully constructed racist locks. She was entirely unsellable, unstealable, and uncontrollable. Faced with an artist who possessed the power to expose the profound moral rot at the foundation of their empire, the Hollywood machine deployed the most devastating, psychologically destructive weapon in its corporate arsenal. They did not issue a loud, dramatic decree banning her from the industry. They did not draft public memos denouncing her performance. The men who ran the studios understood that a public execution generates outrage. It creates martyrs, draws unwanted attention to the dissident, and forces the public to ask dangerous questions. The architects of the Monopoly W are far too sophisticated and far too cowardly for such a clumsy tactic. Instead, they executed a silent bureaucratic assassination. They utilized the terrifying weapon of systemic apathy. They simply established a total impenetrable vacuum around her existence. The mechanics of this corporate excommunication were chilling in their bloodless efficiency. The lucrative contracts that should have materialized after such a staggering performance on film never manifested. The powerful booking agents who controlled access to the mainstream multi-million-dollar theater circuits suddenly developed permanent, unbreakable scheduling conflicts. When Juanita attempted to secure meetings with mainstream producers, she was met by polite, dead-eyed secretaries who smoothly informed her that the executives were indefinitely unavailable. The talent scouts who scoured the vaudeville stages suddenly looked right through her, treating her electrifying, physics-defying performances as if she were entirely invisible. This is the true, unvarnished horror of the Hollywood blacklist. It does not arrive with a heavy gavel or a formal indictment. It arrives as a slow, agonizing suffocation in the dark. It deprives the artist of the fundamental economic oxygen required to survive, the funding, the exposure, the rehearsal spaces, and the professional momentum. Juanita Pitts found herself trapped in a terrifying, invisible cage constructed entirely of corporate silence. She was operating at the absolute peak of her physical and intellectual powers. She possessed the celluloid proof of her genius, permanently captured on the reels of It Happened in Harlem. She was actively performing routines on the underground circuit that left seasoned jazz veterans staring in sheer, unadulterated awe. Yet she was completely and permanently locked out of the economic machinery that converted that genius into survival. The financial strangulation was immediate, deliberate, and severe. Without access to the massive, highly publicized mainstream theater circuits or the lucrative long-term studio contracts, her revenue streams were violently constricted. The grueling, unforgiving reality of the independent underground circuit meant that even as an undisputed headliner, the compensation she received was microscopic compared to the staggering wealth being generated behind the locked gates of Hollywood. She was forced to continue navigating the exhausting, physically punishing logistics of segregated travel, sleeping in damp, unheated rooms, and executing her relentless footwork on splintered floorboards, all for a fraction of the compensation she truly commanded. But the psychological warfare inflicted by this systemic silence was infinitely more damaging than the economic poverty. To possess a towering world-class intellect, to know with absolute cold certainty that you are the greatest living practitioner of your art form, and to watch the entire corporate apparatus of your nation actively pretend you do not exist, is a recipe for profound internal devastation. She had to walk the streets of major cities and look up at the glittering neon marquees of the grand movie palaces, watching the names of compliant, drastically inferior dancers glowing in the night sky. She had to endure the agonizing reality of watching the industry shower millions of dollars, prestigious awards, and global adoration upon performers who had willingly traded their dignity for a feathered skirt, while she was actively starved into obscurity simply for choosing to stand straight. The industry did not break her legs, and they did not physically drag her off the stage. They simply erected a massive soundproof glass wall between her and the rest of the world. She could strike the floorboards with the force of a hammer. She could execute the most breathtaking rhythmic algorithms the century had ever seen. She could scream into the void, but the sound would never reach the other side of the glass. The white executives sitting in Los Angeles had successfully neutralized the threat by refusing to acknowledge its existence. They understood that the human spirit, no matter how fiercely independent, requires external validation and economic sustenance to maintain its velocity. By completely depriving her of both, they were banking on a slow, inevitable attrition. They were entirely content to simply wait her out. They knew that the punishing, relentless schedule of the underground circuit, the lack of basic medical care, and the crushing, suffocating psychological weight of absolute isolation would eventually break down her physical anatomy. They did not need to murder her career. They just needed to patiently watch it starve to death in the shadows. The tuxedo had successfully protected her soul, shielding her from the humiliating, degrading caricatures that permanently stained the legacies of so many of her peers. She had retained absolute sovereignty over her physical presentation and her artistic integrity, but as the 1940s progressed, the terrifying, agonizing cost of that sovereignty became an undeniable, inescapable reality. The flawless white armor she had forged to protect herself from the Hollywood machine had ultimately become the very iron cell they used to lock her away, preparing to push the supreme architect of flat-footed rhythm tap into a darkness so profound that not even her name would survive the descent. The geography of exile is rarely defined by a sudden, dramatic physical relocation. Rather, it is a slow, agonizing constriction of the space you are permitted to occupy. For Juanita Pitts, the transition from the highly competitive, electrified epicenter of the major black vaudeville stages to the suffocating margins of the underground club circuit was not an overnight collapse. It was a methodical, systemic demotion engineered by an entertainment monopoly that refused to tolerate her visual sovereignty. Shut out from the lucrative syndicate, Tess denied access to the prestige theaters that could afford to pay her what her kinetic intellect commanded. The physical environments where she was allowed to exist began to drastically shrink. The grand, sweeping balconies of the Apollo or the Howard Theater were gradually replaced by the cramped, low-ceilinged, smoke-filled basements of second-tier nightclubs scattered across the urban landscape. This was the brutal, unvarnished reality of the independent circuit in the late 1940s and early 1950s. These venues were not designed for the acoustic perfection of a rhythm tap master class. They were makeshift, utilitarian spaces, often poorly ventilated, reeking of cheap gin, stale tobacco, and desperate localized ambition. The physical infrastructure of these clubs was openly hostile to her art form. The floorboards were not the pristine, highly polished oak of the mainstream stages. They were rough, splintered, unvarnished planks of wood, deeply scarred by years of neglect. For a dancer who utilized the close-to-the-floor technique, who relied on microscopic manipulations of kinetic friction to generate high-speed polyrhythms dancing on a damaged floor, is a form of acoustic and physical sabotage. Every protruding nail, every warped board was a physical hazard designed to trip the mechanism, to break the rhythm, or to shatter an ankle. Yet it was within this squalid, architecturally hostile environment that the true, terrifying magnitude of Juanita Pitts' discipline was revealed. When a performer is stripped of the massive, adoring crowds, stripped of the financial compensation, and stripped of the blinding Klieg lights, the core machinery of their ego is violently exposed. Many artists, faced with this level of systemic humiliation, allow their standards to erode. They begin to perform with a heavy, defeated apathy, matching the squalor of their surroundings with a diluted version of their craft. Juanita Pitts did the exact opposite. She treated the splinter, floorboards of a subterranean dive bar with the exact same ruthless, aristocratic reverence that she would have applied to the stage of a Hollywood cinematic palace. Before every single performance, she engaged in the deeply solitary, almost religious ritual of donning her armor. The white three-piece tailored tuxedo was not merely a costume. It was the physical manifestation of her psychological fortress. Maintaining a pristine white tuxedo on a grueling, impoverished touring circuit is a logistical nightmare. It required meticulous, exhaustive labor, pressing the heavy wool, starching the crisp collar, and polishing the heavy leather Oxford shoes until they gleamed like black mirrors. When she stepped out of the damp, unheated, closet-sized dressing rooms and walked into the dim, harsh glare of a single overhead bulb, she did not look like a woman defeated by a racist empire. She looked like a sovereign dictator auditing a heavily compromised territory. She locked her spine, tilted the heavy fedora over her eyes to cast that deliberate, impenetrable shadow, and drove her flat foot into the rotting wood with the concussive, unbothered force of artillery fire. She refused to let the system see her bleed, and she absolutely refused to let them hear her rhythm falter. However, the physical toll of executing this level of heavy artillery flat-footed tap is cumulative, and it operates with a cold, biological inevitability. The human anatomy is not engineered to withstand the explosive, high-velocity impact of driving metal plates into solid wood for decades on end. The kinetic shock wave generated by every single strike travels directly upward, delivering a violent compression to the ankles, the knees, and the lower spine. The elite male rhythm tappers of her generation, men who enjoyed the camaraderie and the shared logistical support of the fraternal tap organizations, frequently suffered from severe crippling joint degeneration by the time they reached their 40s. Juanita was subjecting her body to this exact same mechanical violence, but she was doing it in absolute terrifying isolation. Without the financial safety net of the mainstream industry, there was no access to adequate medical care, no physical therapy, and absolutely no opportunity to rest. To stop dancing was to stop eating. She was forced to continuously push her skeletal structure to the absolute breaking point, wrapping her aching joints in thick bandages beneath the heavy, sharply creased trousers of her suit. She carried the excruciating, bone-deep physical weariness of a heavy industrial laborer. Yet the moment the jazz band initiated the tempo, she was required to execute the rhythmic algorithms with the blinding, frictionless speed of a machine. The audience in those dark clubs never saw the grimace of pain. They only saw the immaculate white lapels and heard the devastating machine gun clarity of her strikes. She absorbed the physical agony internally, transmuting the pain of her marginalized existence into the aggressive, heavy-handed volume of her performance. This isolation was compounded by a profound, deeply gendered double standard that operated even within the fiercely guarded borders of the black artistic community. The systemic racism of mid-century America applied to all African American performers, but the exile imposed upon Juanita Pitts was weaponized by the intersection of both race and gender. The male titans of the rhythm tap world, artists like Baby Lawrence, Chuck Green, and her former rival Teddy Hale, were also systematically locked out of the lucrative white Hollywood establishments. They too were forced to navigate the grueling realities of the underground circuit. However, these men possessed a crucial psychological and historical sanctuary that was entirely unavailable to Juanita: the Brotherhood of the Hoofers Club. In Harlem, the male rhythm tappers had established an exclusive, highly guarded fraternity. It was a physical and cultural space where they gathered to trade rhythmic phrases, engage in brutal cutting contests, and collectively document their own oral history. Even when the white establishment ignored them, the men remembered each other. They codified their steps, they passed their techniques down to younger male protege, and they ensured that the legacy of their kinetic intellect survived within the community. When a male tap genius fell into poverty or succumbed to the physical toll of the art form, his tragedy was romanticized. He was spoken of in hushed, reverent tones by the jazz historians and the younger dancers. His name was preserved in the rhythmic architecture of the generation that followed. Juanita Pitts was an anomaly that this male-dominated fraternity did not know how to process and ultimately did not protect. She had earned their absolute unvarnished respect on the floorboards. They had watched her deconstruct their most complex polyrhythms and fire them back with a heavier, more masculine acoustic authority. They had seen her command the stage in a three-piece suit, projecting a level of untouchable swagger that rivaled their own. But her very existence blurred the rigid, heavily policed gender lines of the era. She was not one of the boys, and she completely refused to be one of the compliant feathered girls. She existed in a solitary, unprecedented category of one. Because she did not fit into the established fraternal hierarchy of the male tappers, and because she was actively exiled by the white corporate monopolies, she had no institutional apparatus to record her legacy. She had no dedicated protege to inherit her specific tailored style of defiance. She was a sovereign queen operating without a court, fighting a multi-front war entirely on her own. As the 1940s bled into the mid-1950s, the technological and cultural landscape of the United States underwent a massive tectonic shift that would serve as the final fatal blow to her visibility. The grueling, decentralized architecture of the vaudeville and theater circuits was rapidly collapsing, rendered entirely obsolete by the explosive rise of television. This new, glowing box in the living rooms of the American public completely centralized the distribution of entertainment. And the television industry was controlled by the exact same white, conservative corporate syndicates that had engineered her exile from Hollywood. Television in the 1950s operated under even stricter, more sanitized racial mandates than the cinema of the previous decade. The networks required highly digestible, completely non-threatening programming designed to appease the suburban white nuclear family. When tap dance was broadcast into these living rooms, it was entirely stripped of its deep, aggressive African-American roots. The cameras focused almost exclusively on the sweeping, graceful, European-influenced choreography of white dancers like Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly. If a black performer was permitted on television, they were heavily restricted to the role of a smiling, jovial entertainer, carefully curated to project compliance. The heavy, combative, intellectually intimidating flat-footed rhythm tap that Juanita Pitts had perfected was considered far too aggressive, far too street, and fundamentally too black for the pristine parameters of mid-century television. And the visual of an African-American woman wearing a man's tuxedo, projecting supreme, unbothered wealth, and dominating the acoustic environment was a broadcast impossibility. The television cameras simply never pointed in her direction. As the live theaters shut their doors one by one, converted into cinemas or torn down to make way for urban development, the physical spaces where Juanita could deploy her genius began to vanish. The underground clubs grew smaller, the audiences dwindled, and the punishing physical toll on her body continued to mount. The acoustic shock waves she had once sent through the grand auditoriums of the East Coast were now confined to the damp, sound-absorbing walls of forgotten basements. She was a master architect of rhythm who had simply run out of floorboards to build upon. Sometime in the mid to late 1950s, the heavy Oxford shoes finally stopped striking the wood. There was no grand farewell tour. There was no highly publicized final performance. There were no reporters from the major newspapers sitting in the front row to document the retirement of a pioneer. She simply packed away the immaculate white tuxedo, placed the heavy fedora in a box, and stepped out of the harsh glare of the single overhead bulb into the absolute, suffocating darkness of historical obscurity. The transition from a living, breathing, artistic sovereign to an undocumented ghost is the most terrifying, bloodless violence a society can inflict upon a human being. When a white Hollywood executive or a celebrated mainstream actor passed away during this era, the machinery of the empire immediately sprang into action to immortalize them. Lengthy, detailed obituaries were drafted and published in the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times, chronicling their achievements, mapping out their lineage, and explicitly defining their value to the cultural fabric of the nation. Their births were celebrated, their deaths were mourned, and their physical remains were marked by towering monuments of granite and marble. The society utilized its vast bureaucratic apparatus to ensure that their existence was permanently burned into the historical record. For an African-American woman who had spent her entire life actively defying the racial and gendered mandates of that exact same society, the bureaucratic apparatus operated with a chilling, punitive apathy. The municipal record-keeping systems of mid-century America placed extremely low priority on documenting the vital statistics of marginalized citizens. A black woman living in the impoverished, racially segregated neighborhoods of an industrial city was practically invisible to the state, unless she was being actively policed. The Hollywood syndicates had already successfully executed their campaign of professional erasure by denying her celluloid immortality. Now the broader social architecture of the United States moved to complete the assassination of her identity. They did not burn her records in a dramatic display of censorship. They simply never bothered to write them down in the first place. This profound, suffocating isolation allowed the machinery of erasure to operate with terrifying efficiency at the end of her life. For decades, dedicated tap historians, genealogists, and cultural archivists have combed through vast oceans of data, federal census reports, employment registries, and the intake logs of segregated hospital wards across the eastern seaboard. They are searching for a single legally binding piece of paper that proves she existed outside of the grainy 1945 celluloid reel. The result of this exhaustive search reveals the abyss of systemic, weaponized neglect. The American state machinery possess the sophisticated bureaucratic capability to track and heavily police its marginalized communities. Yet, it inexplicably failed to record the passing of a generational choreographic genius. We do not possess a single document detailing the exact day she was born into the world, nor do we have any official record of the day she took her final breath. We do not know if she was surrounded by family or if she passed away in the terrifying cold isolation of a segregated hospital ward. A grave is a permanent monument, a physical anchor for memory where the living can acknowledge the weight of a life. By failing to record her passing, the societal apparatus denied Juanita Pitts this fundamental human right. There is no headstone bearing the name of the woman who perfected the close-to-the-floor rhythm tap, no geographical coordinate where modern dancers can travel to lay a pair of Oxford shoes in quiet reverence. They engineered a vacuum so complete that she was not merely forgotten, she was unrecorded. The executives banked on the cynical premise that an unrecorded life is a life that never happened, assuming the acoustic violence of her strikes had been permanently buried alive beneath decades of institutional amnesia. But the Hollywood machine made one fatal miscalculation. They believed they could extinguish a fire simply by looking away. They forgot that a heavy, flat-footed rhythm does not die. It travels underground, vibrating through the floorboards of history until a generation is brave enough to listen. Decades later, modern female tap historians excavated the archives. They unearthed that solitary 1945 reel of It Happened in Harlem. They saw the immaculate white tuxedo, the shadow of the fedora, and the undeniable kinetic authority of the Oxford shoes. They recognized a sovereign queen who had been buried alive. In 2023, the American Tap Dance Foundation finally did what the studio empires were too terrified to do. They officially inducted Juanita Pitts into their Hall of Fame. Ultimately, Juanita Pitts represents a legion of African-American women erased for refusing to shrink, refusing to smile on command, and refusing to wear the degrading uniforms of a racist society. She leaves behind a devastating, beautiful truth. True power is not measured by the applause of a corrupt system. It is measured by the cold, absolute refusal to sell your soul, even if the price of that defiance is your own name. A segregated society may have stolen her tombstone, but they failed to destroy her rhythm. If you respect the uncompromising dignity of Juanita Pitts, like, share, and comment below. The system tried to mandate her silence. It is up to us to speak her name.